Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Won-Duk Cho from the Center for ASEAN Indian Studies at Korea National Diplomat Academy. On behalf of Korea National Diplomat Academy and Jeju Forums, I extend a warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for visiting and participating in this conference. And thank you for joining us for this timely and consequential panel titled "The Return, Trump Return and Changing Indo-Pacific Challenges and Opportunities for ROK and Regional Partners." As you know, the return of President Donald Trump to the White House this year marked profound recalibration of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Pacific region. And his second term is already reshaping to alter the priority and trajectory of the U.S. engagement in the region with a far-reaching implication for strategic architecture and economic security. These shifts are sending strong signals to capitals across the Indo-Pacific, from Seoul to Tokyo, Canberra, and Manila, Jakarta, and New Delhi, and Hanoi, and prompting urgent reassessment of strategic realignment, regional partnership, and national interest. So against this backdrop, this panel seeks to make a sense of the shifting ground beneath us. What do Trump's initial and early moves tell us about Indo-Pacific of the tomorrow, and how might reshape the regional balance of power, and what becomes of the rules-based liberal international order? Most importantly, how should countries, particularly South Korea and its key Indo-Pacific partners, respond? To help us navigate these important questions, we are joined today by 5 distinguished speakers from across the Indo-Pacific. Their expertise will be invaluable as we explore what Trump's second term means not only for regional architecture, but for the broader strategic trajectory in Asia. We hope this discussion will offer not just insight, but important pathways for adaptation, cooperation, and perhaps even leadership in shaping a more resilient Indo-Pacific order. So now we have 5 distinguished experts from our key partners. First, Dr. Lina Alexandra. She is the head of the Department of International Relations at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia. She mainly focuses on ASEAN regional issues and Indonesian foreign policy. And then we have Dr. Nguyen Tin Lain Ain. She is Vice President of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. She has a strong expertise in maritime law and international law. And then we have an expert from Philippines, Dr. Jeffrey O'Daniel. He is currently associate professor at Tokyo International University. And also he is leading forum like We Protect Our Seas, Maritime Forum right now. And we have an expert from India, Dr. Titali Bas. She is associate professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Previously, she worked at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. She mainly focused on East Asia, Japan, and recently Korea, and also in the Pacific region. And the last expert, From Australia, Mr. Tom Coven. He is research fellow at the United States Study Center, Australia. He was a fellow before. He was a fellow at the Pacific Forum. He mainly focused on Indo-Pacific regional affairs and defense industries. Thank you. And let me briefly explain the format of the session. We have two round of sessions, and each panelist will speak in turn, usually based on ASEAN centrality, and then women first and men later. And with that, let's begin our first round of discussions. In the first round sessions, each speaker will have 7 minutes to share their observations and perspectives. With return of President Donald Trump, what do you expect will be the most significant changes in U.S. foreign policy, particularly with respect to Indo-Pacific strategy? How might these changes influence the strategic architecture and the regional order? In addition, what will be the specific implications for your country or the regions? So now I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Alexandra. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Moderator Professor Wanduk, for giving me the chance. And thank you also for inviting me to this excellent forum this afternoon. So regarding your question about the Trump's return and also, what could be the impact to the Indo-Pacific and also particularly to Indonesia as part of the ASEAN. I think first of all, really, the concept of Indo-Pacific, I think, if you all remember, although every country that issue or, established concept basically have different definitions about what Indo-Pacific is, what Indo-Pacific construct that they have in mind. But particularly for ASEAN, I think, and Indonesia, as we also have the so-called ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, I think the concept is something that refers to an open, transparent, and cooperative construct. And with the return of Trump for the second time, I think that really defines, the purpose, the ideals of having the so-called Indo-Pacific construct that we imagined before. That connects between, for Indonesia, it connects between Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, where countries may have their own national interests, of course. They may be engaging in competition, but certainly not rivalry that we want to see. And also, states can always continue in cooperation. And that's something that we do not see with the, as we all know, I think I don't need to mention specifically, we all know what Trump has done for the past just 100 days of his administration. And it's quite damaging. And the way I think Trump, with the tariff policy particularly, we can clearly see how he blurs the lines between, allies and, the so-called, U.S. enemies, basically. And that creates a lot of confusion on how the new regional architecture is going to be. So I think the first, really, there are three things that I can see, about how the Trump's return influenced the strategic architecture and regional order. The first is that plunged the Indo-Pacific construct into uncertain future. So we don't know now. We cannot really envision how the new regional strategic architecture is going to be. Because U.S. is now clearly becoming much more unilateralist, isolationist in its foreign policy, and we don't know what the future will look like, as big powers cannot really coexist with the smaller powers, without simply imposing their powers and vested interests. And that really frightens, I think, countries like us, basically, in Southeast Asia. Let alone there is, we can hardly see that the U.S. truly or sincerely has an interest to engage, to support countries in the region. And secondly, as I mentioned earlier, there is no clear boundary lines of who's who. Who are the allies and how U.S. will treat their allies, and also on how they will treat enemies. Because I think we discussed just before we start the session on how the U.S. make a lot of compromising or concession with the so-called the opposing states. And the third, I think, which is very, very crucial, is the bleak future on multilateralism and multilateral organizations. As great powers like the U.S. Putting forward more on the pragmatic interests rather than norms and values to regulate states' behavior. And without this, clear future about how multilateralism will be in the future, I think it's really hard to imagine that there will be a regional order. What we are seeing is states are moving toward more conflict or tension rather than cooperation and thinking about order, because the big powers are disregarding international norms and rules, and we are going back to the jungle rule. Basically, the strong do what they want, the weak suffer what they must. And particularly for Indonesia, I think Indonesia, as we all know, is a country that keeps the non-alignment principle, the free and active foreign policy stance. But now with this, dichotomy between the U.S. and China in particular, countries like Indonesia are forced to choose sides while we want to maintain our strategic autonomy. And when we want still to pursue, again, multilateral engagement or open regionalism, there is less and less interest from major powers to the open regionalism, especially the so-called ASEAN-led mechanisms. They are being sidelined. We are no longer seeing, countries mentioning about, East Asia Summit, ASEAN +3, RCEP. It's just all being sidelined. And finally, I think it's more difficult for regional states to participate in shaping the global order, as great powers are competing to impose their own interests rather than champion global norms. Maybe I'll stop there, Professor Wanduk, and look forward for more discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lina Alexandra, for your clear assessment of the Trump 2.0's foreign policy trajectory, even if we are not sure how Trump administration's foreign policy is going on, but it is sure that his foreign policy still now is not sincere, reliable in terms of its engagement in the region. And one more important thing is about there is a little boundary between the allies and enemies for the current President Trump administrations. Thank you, Lina Alexandra. Next speaker is from DAV, Dr. Ung-Yen-T Line Ain. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Moderator Wanduk. It's my great honor to be here for the first time in the Jeju Forum, the beautiful islands of Korea. And I have a very difficult question. What is the change of the U.S. foreign policy? I think basically we're all looking for the answer. And the simple answer is that we don't know yet. I totally agree with Lina in saying that we are having an uncertain future waiting ahead. And what we know, perhaps, is the famous slogan, MAGA, Make American Great Again. And Make American Great Again remains the driving force behind the current Trump administration. Of course, it has been implemented since the first administration. In order to do so, I try to trace from what we have known already. From what we already seen in trade, we are talking about the security, but I would like to mention a few areas related to security. Because now I think we are living in a world that we have a undetectable, comprehensive security. So in trade, what we seen Trump did in the first 100 days is the upside-down system. Basically, the WTO is dead. And instead of all the arrangement, all the tariff that we already reached under the WTO, we have the new system, where I think the US administration looking for the new tariff deal, so the new trade deal. And what driving the trade negotiation, we hasn't known yet. We have the example from the UK, but we also have the example from China. Those are the successful negotiation. But we also have the failure negotiation from the EU. So therefore, I agree with the first point that Lina told us, that there are no barriers, there are no lies. But we know for sure that Trump would like to make use of the interest, US interest. Trump would like to bring back the productions, the home shore. So that's why as the result of this product is the restructure of the supply chain. And it will have the huge impact upon all of us, especially the Indo-Pacific, where we heavily contribute to the global supply chain. And the shift of the global supply chains, it also related to technologies. Because nowadays, technology is not just an area confined within its own area. It related to economy, it related to defense, securities, and when we look at technologies, we see the decoupling. Not de-risking anymore, it's decoupling. And the decoupling means that any one of us need to build two separate systems to accommodate the different requirement and standard from two big powers. Whether that choice lasts, I'm not sure. But at least at the moment, it's costly for each of us. And also in the future, really, it increases the pressure to make choice, to take sides. Last but not least, we're talking about the norms and the rules-based order. We see the increasing of unilateral claim. We see the unforeseeable claim that happened in the past. For example, the 51 state of the United States, or the claim from Greenland. Those are unilateral claims that really not only dangerous for the world, but dangerous for our regions, because it will create the adventures for other party. People may think that the rule and norm now all erased. We can build new norm and rules built on the interests of big powers. And therefore, it will increase or at least encourage the adventurous activities from the other parties. In the last 3 years or 4 years, we have seen conflict happen in different parts of the world. Europe, Middle East, and even now we see conflict happen in Asia. Not really in Indo-Pacific, but maybe sooner or later it may spread or expand to our regions. The relocation, the attitude toward the hotspot in the world, and also the relocation of resources from the US administration also trigger the security concern from different countries. In our regions, we have a number of hotspots, North Korea, we have East China Sea, we have South China Sea. We have been long relied on the balance of powers. What if that balance no longer lasts? And therefore, it's really put us in risk, both in security, in the true meaning of a war, a conflict, but also in a trade war, a technology war, and it all give a very negative consequences for our prosperity and for the current security architecture, as well as the framework for cooperation that we all enjoy at the moment. So I believe that, for example, take the case of Vietnam. We are one of the countries that received the highest tariff, 46%. Of course, we received the extension for 90 days, but damage already happened. It really destroys the confidence of the investor. It really destroys the certainty that we enjoy of the business environment that we all have so far. And in the future, I agree with it now that we are facing with the gleaming futures. Multilateralism, of course, no longer exists, as the WTO has been dead, as the UN has been downgraded, and of course, ASEAN. So therefore, we are looking for strengthening of institution, but we haven't seen it. So far, we have the minilateral grouping, and I don't think that it can serve for the role of multilateral institution. It cannot serve for the role of the UN that have to secure peace and security for the last 70 or 80 years. Maybe I just stop here and looking for the second round.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ng and Tin Lan Ain. It seems to me that you mentioned that Trump 2.0 bring all kind of the issues in complex way, in entangled way, not just security and but also technology and economy, all kind of things interconnected, and at the same time, those trends enforce regional powers to take a side in terms of the technology and supply chain decoupling. Thank you. And also, you mentioned that the role of the multilateralism is still important for regional stabilities. And now turn to Dr. Jeffrey O'Daniel.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to Professor Cho for the kind invitation and arrangement. I'm going to talk less of Donald Trump and focus on a specific issue that I'm most familiar with, and that's the South China Sea. These are the questions that were posed to us to respond to. But let me begin by contextualizing the number one national security challenge of the Philippines, which is the South China Sea. You've probably seen this map before, a version of it, but this is probably the one of the most authoritative of them all. This is the infamous 9-dash line map of China. This was released in 2013 by the Chinese government. But this is obviously ambiguous. We don't know what these lines represent, right? Do they represent exclusive economic zone? Do they represent territorial sea? We don't know. Nobody knows because the Chinese government has not clarified. What we know, however, is that if you look at the lines, they enroach into almost 80 to 90% of the exclusive economic zones of littoral states of Southeast Asia. And that includes, of course, the Philippines, right? So I think several estimates have indicated that almost 90% of the Philippines' EEZ on its western front is taken over by these lines. What does that mean? Billions of dollars of oil and gas resources, food security, right, because of the fishery resources and so on. If you look at the legend portion of this map, it says national boundary, right, which is obviously a term that's not existing in the Law of the Sea Convention. But if you zoom out, this is the same line that China is using to demarcate its continental landmass, all right? And so this is a big challenge for the Philippines because if it's just an abstraction, if it's just normative, like there's no practical effect, I'm not going to see that. But if you look at the operations of China in recent years, they have gradually operationalized this claim, right? So if you ask the Chinese right now, what's their southernmost territory, they tell you it's the James Shoal, which is right there off several nautical miles off the coast of the Malaysian state of Sarawak, right? So let's take a look at the James Shoal. Can you see it? You can't see it because it's underwater, right? And it's under international law. Underwater feature cannot be claimed as a sovereign territory. And so, as I've said, the Chinese have gradually operationalized 9-dash line. You can see here the tracking of Chinese patrols in several features that are within the EEZs of other countries. The coercion, obviously targeting the Philippines mainly, but also others. right? And it's happening almost daily in the South China Sea, and we know now that these are happening almost daily because of the transparency policy that's implemented by the Philippine government since 2022. And the coercion is not limited to the littoral states of Southeast Asia. The other states, the user states in particular, the United States, Australia, Canada, have all experienced coercion, dangerous maneuvers in the South China Sea, which I would argue new, right? It was not the case. This was not the case when China was not yet powerful. And these are all in the gray zone. I'm not going to talk about the gray zone. Let me just go and move forward to U.S. policies, the evolution of U.S. policy towards the South China Sea, which is critical to the Philippines. So under President Barack Obama, we had the pivot to Asia, right? And that was tested with the Scarborough Shoal standoff between the Philippines and China in 2012. Obviously, that led to the Philippines' loss of control of a disputed feature. And so the Philippines tried to get American commitment to the Philippines and the United States have a mutual defense treaty, right? And if you look at the text of that treaty, it's almost like a copy-paste of the U.S. ROK, of the U.S. Japan, of the U.S. Australia treaty, right? And the Obama administration was very risk-averse at that time. It did not commit, right? Stick to the policy of strategic ambiguity. Are you going to defend us in the South China Sea or not? The Americans at that time were not telling us, right? And then Trump came to power, and he was obviously less risk-averse. And at that time, the Philippines got two important things. Number one, the Trump administration clarified that Articles 3 and 4 of the Mutual Defense Treaty applied to the South China Sea. So Philippine forces, public vessels, aircraft, troops, if they are attacked in the South China Sea, the treaty obligations of the United States would kick in. So that's something new that the Philippines didn't get from Obama. The other thing, in 2020, Donald Trump also clarified that the U.S. position in the South China Sea is no longer that ambiguous, in that it took a position on the 9-dash line. It labeled the 9-dash line as without basis under international law, clearly making a departure from previous U.S. positions of not really taking sides even on maritime issues. And so those are the things that were, I understand many people hate Donald Trump, but these two things happened during, these two clarification happened when Trump was president precisely because he was less risk averse. And so what has been the Philippines policy, what has been the Philippine policy since then? So two things. Number one, reliance on the deterrent value of the U.S.-Philippine treaty, right? Because that's really the only thing that the Philippines has vis-a-vis China. But also expanding partnerships with like-minded partners who believe in the principles of rules-based order. I understand that's no longer seen positively these days, given what Trump has been doing. But I think that actually is my recommendation, at least for Southeast Asians, right? My two colleagues here have talked about not choosing sides, or at some point, what the Americans are doing is making us in Southeast Asia to take a position or take sides. I think it's not even between the United States and China. It's between what kind of regional order we want. Do we want a regional order characterized by adherence to international law, or do we want something, an order that is based on the dictates of the most powerful? And so I think that's the challenge for Southeast Asia, to assert its strategic autonomy and still champion rules-based order despite what the great powers are doing. So I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for your discussions about South China's issues and U.S. foreign policy in the region. Even if the Trump 2.0 foreign policy is much unpredictable and we are not certain, but it seems to me that the clear point regarding the U.S. foreign policy, especially the Philippines, I think that from the recent Trump administration's foreign policy trajectory regarding the Philippines, the visit from the Defense Secretary, and also the Trump administration just still keep providing the aid to Philippines, and also providing the military equipment to the Philippines for strengthening military capabilities. Thank you, Jeffrey, again. And now we invite Professor Titilibas. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the Jeju Forum and Professor Cho for the kind invitation. And I'm delighted to join such a stellar panel. I'll just echo some of the points that my colleagues have already mentioned, but if we really have to, and I want to start with the caveat that I come from India. So my orientation towards strategic thinking and foreign policy is a bit different from US treaty allies. Now, having said that, if we have to make sense, if we have to cut the clutter and make sense of what is unfolding, the unprecedented churn that is going on in international politics, then two or three points that I would like to organize my thoughts on. First is the disorder and dysfunctional diplomacy. The second would be anarchy, the allies or the US alliances and the fear of abandonment. And third, would be strategic calculations, conflicts, and imposing cost. Now, before we delve into these, three sort of points, there is also a larger question that sometimes in my part of the world we wonder that is it something, the shifts that we are seeing, I think all my colleagues have mentioned about the liberal international order, rules-based order, norms, principles, institutions, WTO, and you name it. But is it something very Trump-specific, or there is the genesis of these discussions and debates predates Trump? Is it something that will outlast Trump? So the major question that we often in Delhi, the policy elites and the strategic community brainstorm on is also whether America is becoming a part of the problem or part of the solution or part of both, actually. So if you look at the shifts, the unfolding shifts in the international system and the consequent, the redistribution of power, this is something that is ongoing for some time, before Trump came in, actually. And also, the arrival of China as a confident power, at least in our part of the world, in Asia, as China's neighbor, and the power disequilibrium between China and its Asian neighbors particularly. I mean, forget about the disequilibrium between US and China at the global level, but at the regional level, this is a reality that we are dealing with. In this context, when we hear about particularly the discussion or the conversation on liberal international order, which basically anchors on liberal democracy, security alliances, open economies, and institutions, multilateral institutions. I think the discussion and crisis on liberal international order is something that started for a while now. There is a very established body of literature on these matters. I think Jeffrey has mentioned about South China Sea and the developments, and we were very keen observing, the developments in South China Sea. But in terms of, when we look at, and United States, I mean, today there is a lot of talk about, Trump's executive order on reviewing all multilateral engagements, institutions, treaties, and so on. But US, of course, from WTO to WHO to human rights, UN organizations, he has basically, a problem with all those platforms and frameworks. But I think if we really take an objective look, US has always been selective in its engagement. US has not ratified UNCLOS, but even though they were heavily invested in in shaping the conversation, they have not really ratified UNCLOS. If you talk about, economy, I think, again, previous colleagues have mentioned about, free trade and protectionism and so on. But be it the Democrats or the Republicans, be it Biden or Trump, they have not gone back to CPTPP. So we really need to, look beyond and take a deeper dive and address the questions how fundamental and bipartisan the China policy. I mean, if you look at Biden's China policy, a lot of it has actually built on what Trump has left for us. So I think we have to kind of ponder on some of these fundamental points. The other thing that, as I mentioned, is allies and adversaries and friends all are treated in a very, the line is blurring very fast. So, and coping with that is becoming quite a policy challenge, I think, in every corner of the world. But the anxiety is, as U.S. resorts to, I wouldn't say isolationism, because I feel that they are not isolating themselves. They are just dealing with each of the countries bilaterally. So there is a difference in that. So I think when you, so if you start taking international politics and international system and all these, rules and principles and norms that guide state interaction, or at least since the end of the war, then I think if you treat it like a boardroom negotiation, that is exactly what is panning out in front of us. I mean, if you think of allies only in terms of, your military expenditure ratio to GDP and what your trade deficit is, that is an extremely inaccurate assessment of what, the other thing that fascinates me is also, look at the people around him, the kind of blatant disregard in public display that we are seeing for allies in Europe, in Asia. This is something which we, at least I as a student of international politics for the last 20 years, is not familiar with. So, and also credit, if you look at Colby, Elridge Colby's, writing, he consistently talked about strategic prioritization, bring back China front and center, and what China is learning from how US is, handling Ukraine. So that is something which, we ponder upon in Asia. Also, I would, like to also flag that you cannot alienate Ukraine. I mean, India took a very different position on, Russia-Ukraine conflict. But at the same time, I think whether it is NATO and the kind of jitters that we are seeing in that part of the world, or it is Asia, or it is if countries, friends like India who are not, we don't have any treaty obligation with the United States. But I think we all are feeling the uncertainty in various ways. I think I ran out of time, so I cannot talk about India specifically, but 2 points I really want to make on India. One is Trump is not all bad news for India. On economic front, he may be the final shock that India needs as a system towards economic reforms. I think that his kind of negotiations on tariffs will force us to undo a lot of structural reforms that is urgently needed. On the geopolitical front, and that this is, I promise, my last sentence, I think the trajectory that he has taken with India is only going to, he's going to lose India very soon if he kind of continues with, with dismissing the concerns of 1.45 billion people on this planet. Interfering in our internal affairs is something we have not welcomed across administrations since the 60s and 70s, and that is a stated policy. We are hopeful that we will not allow Trump to use our space for some social media post or some global headlines that he could make, because he's not making any headway in Ukraine and Gaza. So I'll stop here and maybe come back on the next round. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Titilibas, for your comprehensive discussions about various issues that the Trump administration's give effect on the regional affairs. I think that this you are saying reflect current Trump administration, only just over 100 days, but it seems that the Trump administration touched upon a lot of the regional and world issues. Thank you again. And last speakers, Mr. Tom Coven, floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Cho, and thanks to the Jeju Forum for having me here. It's always nice to be back on this beautiful island. So actually, I think my presentation is going to flow quite nicely out of Professor Basu's remarks, because I think I'm going to focus more on the evidence of continuity that we have from Trump 1.0, from Biden, than we do have evidence of major strategic challenges, because, I mean, from my perspective, and to be very blunt, I think we're in a position where we have conjecture and we have theories. We have evidence from other parts of the world as to how the Trump administration might go about foreign policy and defense policy and strategy in Asia. We have very limited evidence so far of how it's going to do it in Asia, besides actions that it's taken on things like trade that have had ramifications for economic and trade policy discussions in our region. I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as I can because I've got limited time, but maybe just to reflect very briefly on Trump 2.0 at 100 days. You can broadly describe what the administration has tried to do at home in broad policy terms, but including with foreign and defense policy, as a bit of a shock and awe campaign. And it's been referenced to me by Republican friends in the United States who previously served in different departments of yesteryear as 2025 being the year of deconstruction. So essentially what the Trump administration is seeking to do in its first 365 days in office here is to dismantle or to rebuild and refashion some of the key tools of American foreign policy, be they institutions and departments at home, be they America's relationships with key multilateral agreements around the world, be they the terms and conditions of specific alliances that America has around the world, including in Asia. I think if you consider the deconstruction imperative, it actually helps to make a lot of sense of what the Trump administration is trying to do across the board. On the broad kind of foreign policy side of things in terms of priorities, it's fairly evident from where the administration has focused most of its attention so far in practice that its priorities are closer to home, and at least in the first 100 days, they have been focused on trying to put out some fires around the world, ostensibly to focus more on our region. But in practice, we don't actually have the evidence that that is actually what will happen. We've had encouraging rhetorical signals from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth when he visited the region recently, and he said the Indo-Pacific was America's #1 priority because it was the region of consequence. But as I'll get to in a minute, we've also seen decisions on the policy front that have undermined that claim directly. But in terms of practice, in terms of diplomatic attention, in terms of headlines, which we all know Trump cares about very deeply, it has been on homeland security and border security in particular. And it's also been about trying to find a resolution to the Ukraine conflict, which isn't looking promising, to say the least, without going into detail. But it's also been about trying to kind of put a full stop on America's footprint in the Middle East. I mean, Trump's address in Saudi Arabia saying that America was done with interventionism while reserving the right to interfere in the Middle East again, depending on how negotiations with Iran go, I think is kind of an example of how, despite the rhetoric of prioritization, despite the sincere efforts, I think, to actually fully deliver on the pivot that Jeffrey mentioned, there are these kind of foreign policy attention magnets, as it were, that could yet draw American attention away from our region again in the coming years. The evidence that we have so far in terms of Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy, I would say, as I said at the outset, that one, we have more evidence of continuity than change thus far. But two, the signs we're getting so far is that the way the administration is looking at our region, they're looking at it primarily in terms of crafting a China strategy, not necessarily an Indo-Pacific strategy. So in terms of consistencies between the last administration, but also Trump 1.0, also Obama, successive administrations have singled out the Indo-Pacific as America's priority. That is not new. As I said, Secretary Hegseth said that when he swung through the region a couple of months ago. We've had Taiwan framed as the main kind of force structure defense strategic concept so far, around which American defense decisions in Asia will be based. We've also had some clear signals, at least from Secretary Hegseth on defense, that America first does not necessarily equal America alone. Yes, the Trump administration is going to be more confrontational in its relationship with its allies, but it's not necessarily looking to abandon those allies if they quote unquote get on the bus. So in other words, if they kind of sign up or if they agree generally with what the United States is trying to do in the region and they are willing to contribute more to it in terms of defense capability, in terms of military spending, what have you. I think that's reflected in some of the recent developments that we've seen in the US-Japan and US-Philippines relationships, the initiatives that have been advanced in recent months, actually Biden era and Obama era initiatives that are kind of fully delivering on their promise, at least so far. And just maybe to make one more point on this slide would be the change in this view of burden sharing towards something which I've heard MAGA intellectuals refer to as burden owning. So at least in the European context, where this concept is most prevalent, it's an idea that the United States is willing to work with its allies and partners to tackle collective security challenges, but it doesn't necessarily always want to be the leading partner in that. It wants its allies to own the fundamental responsibility of looking after what this administration realistically sees as their security challenges, some of which are shared by the United States, but to varying degrees. I've only got 45 seconds left, so I'll make this quick, but I think if you really want to start speculating about what Trumpian foreign policy and strategy is going to look like in Asia, you really have to be paying attention to what is happening in Congress right now. The gutting of the State Department budget, the gutting of US aid, for all the talk of $1 trillion defense budget, the fact that that is based on some pretty shonky mathematics, and this administration is actually requesting less than what Biden planned to request for this year. The congressional deadlock around kind of crafting a government-wide budget, the signs of dysfunction and the growing differences between different parts of the administration on what America's foreign policy priorities should be. I think if you want to understand how Trump is going to look in our region in the coming years, you really have to be focusing on what's happening in Congress, in Washington, with a laser focus and under a pretty keen microscope. I'm out of time, so I'll leave it there. Maybe I can speak to the consequences of all of this for Australia and for the wider region in the next set of remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for your observations and assessment. Listening to your observations and discussions, I ask myself that Trump administration's focusing on China, actually the China strategy, is not necessarily similar to Indo-Pacific strategy, which means that they primarily provide regional public goods in terms of security and economic and so on. So that's very important implications. Thank you. And now I move on the second round, and which is very important for South Korea. Next week we will have a new South Korean government. In that context, I would like to ask each panelist regarding potential areas of cooperation between South Korea and your country in order to navigate the great power competition and also unpredictability and uncertainty, and even the very complex way of the U.S. Trump 2.0 foreign policies. And first, again, now I'd like to invite Dr. Lina Alexandra. And Indonesia actually one of the few countries that South Korea have as a special strategic partnership. So your country have our key partners regarding the trade and defense industry and so on. Could you give us some suggestions regarding two-country cooperation collaboration in this regional and geopolitical context?
Okay, thank you, Professor Wonduk. I think I will start by going back to the point that Dr. Basu mentioned about, the return of the Trump administrations really shake us from our comfort zone. I think that's really clear. And with that, from the perspective of ASEAN countries like Indonesia, I think we observe the recent development about the rejuvenation of the trilateral cooperation. I think that's something that we want to see to develop further, between Japan, South Korea, and China, because I think that's actually the +3 of ASEAN, and we want to see that particular cooperation to continue further. It's exactly because, like it has been mentioned earlier, that the U.S. now is changing its strategy to deal with countries more bilaterally. And if we can flip the questions, really, can middle powers, actually change the way we engage with the U.S.? How we can strengthen the so-called middle power coordination in order to, navigate our ways in dealing with the impact of the destructive policies from the current U.S. administration. That's the first thing on how we can strengthen the middle power collaboration to deal with the real issues, the real global and regional issues. Secondly, in terms of the Indonesia-South Korea cooperation, you rightly mentioned that now is the stage of the special strategic partnership since 2017. And between Indonesia and South Korea, I think there has been really a deepening partnership between the two, especially on economic and defense industry cooperation. And I think under the Prabowo administration, that will continue for sure. But I remember there was a discussion in Jakarta with the South Korean counterpart on which new area of cooperation can be, further strengthened between Indonesia and South Korea. I think the first is because we want to catch up with our digital capacity development. Because we know now if we want to achieve, maintain our economic growth, I think digitalization of the economy is very, very important. And South Korea, the way we say it, South Korea is quite, balanced in terms of the relations with the US as well as with China. So in that sense, Korea, the way we see it, is having its own strategic autonomy to some extent. And Korea, in terms of technology, is also very, very advanced. And at the same time, Korea is having a very strong interest to actually invest in Indonesia. So that's one thing. And secondly, also in relation to technology as well, is how we deal with the climate change, especially on how we can, like South Korea, helping developing countries like Indonesia to catch up with, it's a carbon, commitment, things like that, in order to reduce our emission, in order how we can actually change our, doing our energy transition smoothly. And I think contribution, support from a country like South Korea, who is actually very advanced in those particular areas, I think is very, very important. So at least in those two areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lina, for your making suggestions regarding the practical cooperation between ROK Indonesia, not just the broader sense of the partnership, like between the middle powers in the regional context. At the same time, bilateral context, we can collaborate over the issues like digital transition and digital capacity building, and also dealing with climate changes. Thank you. And now invite Dr. Ng T. Line Ein But your country is our, the one of the most important country partners. Especially we have the comprehensive strategic partnerships. I think 2 years ago, and so moving ahead for materialized our partnerships. Could you make us some suggestions?
Well, thank you. Coming to the second round, I'd like to just continue my point, elaborate on the first round. First, on trade and technologies. Vietnam and South Korea really are strong partners with each other. The investment and the trade volume that South Korea have with Vietnam just gradually increase over years. So therefore, the tariff that the Trump administration that imposed on Vietnam also have consequences to South Korea. We are sharing the supply chain. The supply chain may start from Korea and come to China upon the first Trump because of Trump plus China plus one, and then go to Vietnam to put some extra value and then export to the US. So if Vietnam faced with the heavy tariff, then it's also really consequences for South Korea. So I think the first thing that South Korea and Vietnam should cooperate to interpret the element of China's in our goods and services export to the US. Because not all account for the transshipment that the US government doubt about the export from Vietnam and Korea. Second, I think the US cannot stay alone. The US also would like to change the structure of the supply chain, bring home shoring, but it's not overnight. The US still need to rely on allies and partners in many areas. And Vietnam and South Korea will have the advantages to work with each other in some of their area that also can contribute to the United States. Name as a few, I think, first is shipping, and second, of course, critical minerals. The second point I would like to elaborate is that security. Although ASEAN has been sidelined, but a fact that we cannot deny is that EAS remain the single forum that contain all the countries that couldn't have a dialogue with each other at the moment. Namely North Korea, namely Russia, and China and the US, all in one forum. So I think what Korea and Vietnam together with ASEAN, other ASEAN countries can do for the region is to renew the agenda of EAS, to make it more practical. And by that way, I think we can foster dialogue and we can prevent conflicts. Last but not least, I think peace and security in our regions cannot just be relied on big powers. Small and medium power also have a say. And we together, if we united, we can make our own arrangement for the regions. I haven't touched upon in the presentation one of the very important issue about nuclear weapons. Because I see that the recent conflict happened around the world raised the tendency of the use of mass destruction and nuclear weapons. So let's think about our own regions. If we take the lead in some of the security issue and work together, show our goodwill and initiative, and perhaps give room for big power to play, but not dominate like their own initiative, we can help them to become more responsible power and maintain the balance in our regions. I think North Korea or Korea Peninsula has been remaining a problem for a long time, and there is a potential for nuclear issues. And it's one of the issues I think Korea can take the lead and work together with ASEAN in some of the mechanisms that we already have in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lan Ain, for your suggestions. And given the strong partnership between Vietnam and Korea on the technology and trade and economies, you mainly focus on the Korea and Vietnam's cooperation on the tariffs and supply chain issues. Thank you for your suggestions. And now turn to Jeffrey for yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. So since President Duterte left, there has not been any controversy in the U.S.-Philippine alliance, and I think that's because compromises are easily reached. So, for example, with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA basis in the Philippines, there's a priority for the Philippines, obviously, to deter China in the South China Sea. But obviously, the United States has broader priorities, for example, deterring the invasion of Taiwan. And so a compromise to that is having EDCA, or having the United States be present in bases facing both the South China Sea and Taiwan. And the United States, I think for a time, was also looking for places to deploy their Typhoon missile system. And the Philippines provided them the land to deploy Typhoon missile bases, even though there was a strong objection from China. And so I think a compromise and making sure that the Americans are also aware of what's in it for them, I think it's important at this point, especially since Donald Trump is in power. We can't just expect the United States to give us everything. We have to make clear what's in it for them as well, because it's the American taxpayers that's holding these politicians accountable, right? Obviously, Donald Trump is very erratic and may not be very reasonable, but as alluded by my colleague here, there may be fundamental issues here that goes deeper and goes beyond Donald Trump. Regarding the avenues for cooperation between the Republic of Korea and the Philippines, I think Korea has proven itself to be a reliable source of defense hardware, right? So over the past, it's because of Korea that the Philippines regained supersonic capabilities, for example, with the 12 FA-50 trainer jets that was procured by the Philippines. And I think the government has signaled that it's intending to buy 12 more FA-50 fighter jets from Korea. And just last week, a frigate was inaugurated in Manila, and that was built by Hyundai. And so these are reliable defense hardware that allow the Philippines to be present in the South China Sea. And presence matters, especially in terms of resisting gray zone coercion, right? Because you want to make sure that you're able to sustain your presence and withstand the Chinese coercion at sea. But it's not just in terms of military, but also diplomatic support. South Korea has expressed support for the 2016 Arbitral Award, which invalidated China's 9-dash line map. And so that's an important diplomatic support. And I think since the transparency policy of the Philippines vis-a-vis the South China Sea, South Korean Foreign Ministry has also been calling out China indirectly, expressing concerns regarding the coercive maneuvers at sea. I think already 13 times the Foreign Ministry of Korea, South Korea, issued statements regarding Chinese coercion at sea. And that is an important support for the Philippines because regardless of great power competition, the Philippines' position is that the rule of law in the South China Sea should prevail and that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea should remain the mechanism through which everything is resolved and managed. And I just want to mention very briefly the nuclear weapons challenge that was mentioned by Professor Lan-an. And I think that's an emerging issue in the Philippines. Obviously, that's something that's not a top-of-mind security issue in the Philippines. But if you look at the studies conducted by the Department of Defense of the United States, there is a prediction that in 15 years, China would reach nuclear parity with the United States, right? So China now has about 500, 600 operational nuclear warheads. The United States has 1,500 active nuclear warheads. So if the current trajectory continues, that means nuclear parity between China and the United States, if not superiority. What does that mean for a U.S. ally like the Philippines, right? When the abandonment argument is so strong already at this point, it will be even more difficult, perhaps, for the Philippines to count on the credibility of the U.S. alliance commitments when the adversary is a nuclear peer. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for your suggestions. And as far as I know, we made strategic partnerships last year, and I think we have more opportunity to cooperate on various issues. You mentioned that defense industry cooperation. At the same time, we have the shipbuilding facilities in Philippines. So we have a variety of opportunities for cooperations. Thank you again. And now turn to Professor Titilibas for your suggestions. India and Korea have a special strategic partnership similar to Indonesia. So given the importance of the India in a global context, I think Korea need to, and also India need to boost strategic partnership between two countries. Could you give me your suggestions? Thank you.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more that we need to do a lot in this bilateral front. So, I'll just build on what I was trying to argue earlier. Is obviously all great powers engage in order building projects, and US have done so for so many decades and so successfully. We are now seeing alternative ideas and frameworks and institutions from the Chinese, and I think there is a sense from this panel that we are all concerned about much more fundamental issues across the world. Similarly, we are seeing competing vision of order, balance of power, ideologies, and different brands of politics between these two competing strategic competitors, irrespective of Trump or Biden. For example, when we saw alternative arrangements or institutions like AIIB came in, it had nothing to do with Trump. Right, so essentially, what is happening is the moment U.S. kind of retrenches from this space, it's only natural for China that it's going to double down and kind of seize that space, and that is exactly how, if we read the rise and fall of all great powers, there is a pattern, right? So we are expecting China is doing exactly what is expected, but unless we in Asia are ready to live in a Sino-centric Asian order, we have to come together and like really brainstorm and double down on trilateral, minilateral, you name it, regional frameworks. And I think particularly in the context of I would say East Asia, or particularly South Korea, because India approaches this region through the Act East policy. And if we look at that basket, which includes ASEAN, which includes Japan, sometimes what I wonder is, we call it a special strategic partnership, but I think what it lacks is a strategic vision. Because we have just, celebrated 50 years of India-Korea relationship. But if you look at the strategic depth of this bilateral relationship, we hardly kind of see a vision when I compare it with India-Japan relationship, for example. If you look at India-Japan relationship, while both the countries, because as you know, India is on a trajectory of growth, and we are trying to source technology and capital investments on infrastructure and any Asian partner. So the advantage India has is we are not bound by the constraints of technical alliances, right? That is why you see India can work with Russia, India is trying to work with US, Europe, and Asian partners. But I genuinely believe that we are lacking strategic vision, because way back in 2015, India and Japan issued a Indo-Pacific Vision 2025. And sitting in 2025, when I look back at that vision, we have not only achieved everything, but much more, because between 2015 and 2025, we did not prepare for a global pandemic. We did not prepare for, prepare for US-China strategic competition at this level. We did not prepare for, the conflicts and the shocks that we see in the system today. But in each case, we have been able to kind of deepen our conversation and bring some global goods together, not just with Japan, but for example, if you look at, obviously the future of Quad is also up in the air, but Quad actually sees the opportunity during the pandemic to kind of convert it into something of a vaccine partnership, which was much more acceptable to Southeast Asian countries, because it's no longer about the strategic competition, choosing sides. It's just, you have to bring some value, right? You don't threaten ASEAN centrality or touch on the sensitivities. So we in the trilateral frameworks, we have that kind of a tempo and thought is missing in the India-Korea kind of bilateral relationship. And all these things, when you have a strong bilateral relationship, it easily converts into trust building, into trilaterals or minilaterals. For example, I wonder why India and Korea don't coordinate enough on regional platforms. I think I agree with my colleagues flagging East Asia Summit, ADMM+. There are so many common issues. I understand we in Asia, you in Northeast Asia have a very different set of security drivers. We in South Asia have very different set of parameters determining our policy choices. But at the same time, we have to kind of think it through. For example, maritime security is a common concern, right? So India has launched Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, and there are many countries, Japan, Australia, France, Indonesia, Singapore, working with us in each of these 7 pillars. So, South Korea can also join. For example, something as basic like India hosts the Information Fusion Center for Indo-Pacific in Gurgaon, and there are, the very low-hanging fruit is liaison officers. We have from across the world, US, UK, Australia, and so on. South Korea can, Japan including. So South Korea can, so those kind of, regional thinking, I think, is lacking in the bilateral relationships, and we need to do some hard work on that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bass. I would like to skip my summary given the limited time and turn to Mr. Tom Coben for your suggestions, please.
Thanks, Professor Cho. At the outset, I don't think the way that Australia looks at the strategic balance in Asia changes all that much just because we have a second Trump administration. It's not to say that the changing nature of the way that America engages in the Indo-Pacific won't have an effect on what Australia does with different countries, but the organizing principle for how Australia goes about building regional relationships is going to stay the same. Because the fundamental objective for Australia is going to stay the same, which is, as our Foreign Minister Penny Wong put it a couple of years ago now, for Australia, this is about achieving a strategic equilibrium in the region where the US remains indispensable, but it is not the single most important power in the regional strategic balance equation anymore. In other words, we can't rely on it to carry the water for everybody, to balance out the region as China's power grows. But in that sense, it's not only China's power that is growing, it is the power of all the other kind of the poles in the multipolar system that's emerging in Asia. Whether that's Australia, whether that's South Korea, Japan, key players in Southeast Asia represented on this panel. So in that sense, we have to get comfortable, I think, or more comfortable with an idea that it is possible to cooperate on a bilateral, minilateral, multilateral level between us without America. It still makes sense to collaborate with America when it makes sense for us. But we also have to understand that one, we're going to have to explore options to collaborate without America when we have to, because two, America might not be interested in collaborating with us on things like development, for example. Just because America doesn't care about development in certain parts of the Indo-Pacific doesn't mean that we shouldn't. Just because the Trump administration isn't interested in kind of a regional economic partnership or economic integration doesn't mean that we aren't. I mean, the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership is probably the best example of what we can do even when America isn't engaged. Like the fact that that agreement survived Trump 1.0 pulling out of it, and not only survived, but is looking to expand. I mean, I was reading in the news this morning that former South Korean trade minister has recommended that Korea open negotiations to join. I think that's a good example of the sorts of things that we can be done. And we can't fully replace what America can bring to bear in any given context, particularly on the defense side. But we can do things to help manage the power transition, to help manage the increasingly multipolar region, to ensure that our interests are still looked after, even if the nature of American engagement in the region is changing. So some specific examples of what that might look like for Australia and Korea. I mean, at a very basic level, we should be kind of finding new ways to engage that help us not just to respond to US strategy, but find ways where we can shape it. Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines increasingly, like our voices in the halls of power in Washington are more powerful than I think most people tend to think. And it's not only the president we need to convince in this instance, it is the people who occupy the key positions in the Pentagon, in the State Department, in the Commerce Department, what have you. Like, just because of the nature of the way that America engages with the world is changing doesn't mean that they won't listen to our voices, they won't listen to our concerns. They may not take them on board eventually, but we never know until we try. We're going to have to look at specific development assistance initiatives, economic integration assistance, those sorts of things, whether that's in a bilateral context for Australia and Korea, but for those things it probably makes more sense to go broader. Whether that's a new minilateral partnership with, say, Japan, which is a conversation that's been going on now for maybe 18 months. But other existing regional institutions, some of which we've mentioned by name in this panel, they're still there, they're still functional, they're still valuable to every country represented on this panel and not. In terms of what Australia and Korea can do specifically, defense industry has already been mentioned. I think that is a real strength that Korea brings to bear in the region. It can provide capacity, it can provide defense technology that is increasingly excellent and high quality. We can look at energy collaboration, especially as Australia is looking to kind of fuel the energy transition at home, and the technological advantages that Korea and the market advantages, frankly, that Korea can bring to bear on that front. And then on development assistance in the region, again, Australia and Korea both very present in that space in the region more broadly already. But in that space, initially, I think we may have to resist the urge to create new shiny examples of bilateral or minilateral cooperation and focus on coordinating better in order to make sure that we're not doubling up on the kinds of things that we're trying to provide to the region, which not only represents a needless spend on our parts if we're spending money on the same thing, but there is a saturation point for recipient countries in the region too, where if you give too much, they can't process it fast enough for it to be worthwhile. And I've heard anecdotes of that happening in the Pacific Islands, for example, where there's a premium on building institutional resilience and fostering democratic norms and good process and whatnot. But there's so much aid coming in that the recipient country can't actually get through all of it, to the extent where their officials are spending more time in training seminars than actually governing. So that's just one example, and it may be rather flippant, but I think it's something to keep in mind, that we should be looking to coordinate, to deconflict, to make sure that we're all achieving the objectives that we want to achieve in the most efficient and cost-effective way possible.
Thank you, Tom. After listening to suggestions and the discussions from the all panelists regarding the potential avenue of cooperation between South Korea and regional partners, your countries, I think that there is some common grounds among the 5 panelists. There are two layers of 2 levels of cooperation between Korea and the regional partners. One is the some people said middle power partnership, and some people indicates a spoke-to-spoke cooperation without U.S. involvement, because we have our own regional issues, and we need to provide the regional public goods, while U.S. Given domestic issues and its foreign policy, do not want to much engage in providing regional public goods. In that sense, we need to collaborate and cooperate in a multilateral form, at the same time unilateral forms. And also we have another levels, cooperations, bilateral cooperation, depending on each country's priorities. So that is my summary for our discussions. And we have time for a few questions from audience, and I will ask you introduce yourself and directly ask a question to specific panelists. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Hyung-wook Bu from Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. You know, I'm studying defense policy and especially arms control issue. Even though many experts, some experts shed light on some kind of good news on the Trump second term, but if any, is there any more good news in the area of arms control issue in Indo-Pacific region? I'm thinking of the U.S., China, Russia nuclear negotiation will be possible under the Trump second term. Do you think is it possible? Anyone can anyone say about this? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to give that one a stab. I mean, the short answer in the short term is no. I don't think so on arms control. That's not exclusive to Trump. I think that is a fairly well-established view on the Republican side of politics in the U.S. And if you look at some of the actions that are being taken on things like the missile technology control regime, for example, where the U.S. and its partners like Australia and the United Kingdom in the context of AUKUS are looking at revising their policy positions on that particular treaty in order to facilitate defense trade. It's not that the value of arms control has been totally thrown out. I think there are still pockets in the US system that see that as valuable. But there's also a pretty well-entrenched view now that arms control is actually preventing the US from getting after certain defense and foreign policy objectives with its allies. And I don't think we're at the end of the road on that front yet. When it comes to reaching kind of like a trilateral arms control agreement with China and Russia, I mean, it's Trump we're talking about, so you can't rule it out. And if you look at some of the comments he's made in his first 100 days, he's talked about reaching some kind of grand bargain with China and Russia where they all cut their defense spending by 50%, which I don't think is going to happen. But again, it's this president. He's unconventional. He likes dealing with the leaders of China and Russia. You couldn't definitively say this isn't going to happen in the future, or that any sort of arms control discussion won't come up again. But I think, again, just to kind of wrap this up, I think the view on the Republican side of politics at the moment is that you need to selectively proliferate specific systems that were once controlled in order to change the balance of power vis-a-vis the US and its adversaries in order to create basically the new terms for future arms control negotiations.
Yes.
Is this working? Okay. My name is Robert Kelly. I teach political science at Busan National University. I have a question for Dr. Orudañel. So I think lots of us in this room have been to these panels over the years that show sort of the map of the South China Sea and sort of like creeping Chinese, right? The Chinese kind of creeping further and further south. And you know, Xi Jinping told Obama apparently that he wasn't going to militarize. It turned out to be a lie. He is, right? Your slide showing the Chinese getting as far down as Indonesia. That I've never actually seen that the Chinese, the PLN, was that far south. And I think we've all also seen a lot of these videos about Chinese fishing vessels, quote unquote, you know, Chinese Coast Guard sort of, you know, spraying Philippines. I mean, so we know this. So I guess my question for you, as a Filipino academic who's worked on this, is what is the response you would like to see from capable partners in the region? Like if the Philippines could get like an ideal response. I mean, we're not going to go to war with China or something like that, but like, you know, like a robust response from the parties that care about the South China Sea, the U.S., the Australians, South Korea, Japan. What would you all like to see? Because it seems like now we're all just kind of waiting around while the Chinese kind of just creep further and further south. And pretty soon it's going to be a fait accompli where it's going to be a Chinese lake because we just didn't want to risk escalation with China. So I'm curious what all you would like on your side. Thank you.
Yeah, so I want to answer that question by going back to my gray zone coercion challenge, right? Because the problem with gray zone coercion, I think this is not just a challenge for the direct recipient, the Philippines, but also for others who may be interested in helping. Gray zone coercion results in decision paralysis, right? And as you've rightly noted, if you're the Philippines, you respond and you may risk escalation and a repeat of the Mischief Reef incident or the Scarborough Shoal incident, and the status quo is reversed. In other words, you may lose a territory or a maritime zone because of your escalatory response. On the other hand, if you don't respond, you may be inviting more aggression. So what is the best response, right? So that remains to be a very difficult thing to answer. But I think over the past couple of years, it's clear that presence matters. But for a very long time, the Philippines did not have the capacity to be present in all areas. It has a vast maritime zone in the South China Sea. And so I think that's an answer to your question. We want to see partners and allies to help the Philippines maintain presence by doing what? By giving us the capacity to be present, by giving us maritime domain awareness capabilities. And these are the things that they have started to do, but obviously the challenge is enormous, right? The Philippine Coast Guard, for example, has received Coast Guard vessels from Japan, has received frigates from Korea, obviously through procurement. But these are not enough. Some of those, before the Coast Guard vessels from Japan arrived in, I think, 2016, the Philippine Coast Guard could not patrol sustainably. They go there and then they have to go back because the fuel capacity of their vessels was too small to really patrol long term. Now they are able to go out there, patrol for 30 days. And so I think that the Chinese, probably not anytime soon, probably they would not really fire the first shot. But so the presence is the challenge is maintaining presence, and that's the struggle that the Philippines has. And so that's one big thing that I think the partners can do. But to go back to your question, also with the United States, it's a little bit difficult because the Philippines also does not want to have a war with China, but at the same time, it wants a stronger commitment from the United States, and that commitment has been manifested in some ways, but in other ways it has not. So for example, when the Chinese started building artificial islands in South China Sea, President Obama said there would be consequences if you keep building. The Chinese finished the artificial islands and then started militarizing them. Obama said there would be consequences if you militarize the islands. China militarized the islands anyway. No consequences whatsoever. So I think it's time for allies in particular to start talking about imposing costs. What are the costs that are acceptable to everyone, right? Because if you impose cost on China, China will retaliate. So what is an acceptable cost that everyone can impose on China? And that's a very difficult question to answer. So, for example, I would say sanctions, for example, on the artificial islands, right? So the consequences, for example, I think Marco Rubio when he was senator, introduced a bill to sanction several people engaged in that project, reclamation project, and also the companies directly involved in that project. So those are the kinds of things that should be done, but I think those were not done in a big way that's consequential enough. But again, yeah, that's a very, if I have answered to this question, probably the problem has been solved already.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I think it's time to wrap it up. And on behalf of the Korea National Diploma Academy and the Jeju Forum, I truly thank you all panelists for your wonderful discussion and fruitful suggestion for Korea. And also the audience, very good questions, and thank you for your time to stay here. Thank you. Thank you very much.